During the course of the more recent episodes of the History of the World podcast, we have explored the medieval history of the Far East and of Southeast Asia. Beyond the Asian landmass, which contains China and Indochina in its easternmost fertile reaches, are a number of islands of different shapes and sizes and of varying distances from the major land masses of planet Earth, across the vast Pacific and Indian Oceans. The most discussed original migration into this area of the world was discussed way back in Volume 1, when we speculated about the journey of humankind from mainland Asia to the huge island of Australia and the origins of the peoples that we call Aboriginal Australians, and this may have happened around 50,000 years ago. In contrast, Australia's neighbours in New Zealand recall that the first humans to settle their lands were the Maori Polynesians, only around 750 years ago. Do historians know the story of how the islands to the south of mainland Asia were populated? And how was there such a difference in the timelines? This episode explores those theories. The History of the World podcast, written and presented by Chris Hasler.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
And we're live from the living room as Doug eyes up the match day spread. He's reaching for the buffalo wing. Perfect! Hang on, what's this? Oh, he's gone for a can of Pepsi too! Incredible! What a finish! Sensational combination! Look at the delight on his face. There's no doubt about it. It just tastes better. Match days deserve Pepsi. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a pack of Pepsi Zero Sugar for today's match. It's poetry in motion.
Volume 4, The Medieval World. Episode 82, Austronesian Expansion. During Volume 1, we explored the theory of how humans were able to migrate to Australia. It was important for us to understand the prehistoric geography of this area of the world, as it was very different to the map that we see today. During the last Ice Age, many of the islands between mainland Asia and mainland Australia were connected to each other, and often interned to one of the major land masses by land bridges that have since been submerged by rising sea levels. These rising sea levels isolated the Japanese archipelago, the British Isles, and some of the islands of the Caribbean, which were previously connected to their mainland neighbours. Despite the fact that many islands of maritime Southeast Asia were connected to larger neighbours during the Ice Age, it is not believed that one could walk from mainland Asia to mainland Australia without crossing water. Although it is obvious that the water crossings would not have been quite as daunting back then as they appear in today's world. Various theories exist regarding how humankind first reached Australia, but generally it is believed that the migration came from mainland Asia and it required the use of boats. of which we have none preserved as evidence. However, it is believed that there had to have been boats in order to survive the journey, and that the presence of boats demonstrates the experience of maritime travel existing before the journey to Australia. Maybe this not only indicates that the first societies who travelled to Australia specialised in fishing, but also that there could have been a maritime trade network. There is a lot of speculation based around the absence of evidence about these theories. Some theories suggest that humans accidentally drifted across the waters to Australia. But more recently, some historians strongly suggest that it was a deliberate exploration. It is often the case that we do not give our prehistoric ancestors enough credit for their abilities, and that their capabilities were very advanced, for the reason that they had the same cognitive abilities as us. And it may be that their cognitive abilities were actually stronger than me and you, who are likely to survive to old age without needing to learn how to survive on our own without modern technology. During the last ice age, the island of New Guinea was attached to Australia by a land bridge, and we referred to this extended landmass, which also included the island of Tasmania, as Sahul. So New Guinea could have been the first part of Sahul that experienced human habitation, although, once again, this is not known. It's certainly not impossible for boats to have reached Australia first, before humans migrated to New Guinea on foot. The earliest and therefore indigenous peoples of New Guinea are called Papuans, and it is a genetic fact that they are closely related to the Aboriginal Australians, with there being a separation in the few thousand years after the first migration from Sunda, the Ice Age landmass of the connected Southeast Asian islands and Southeast Asia, to Sahul, the Australia-New Guinea landmass. There is no firm evidence of interaction between these prehistoric Sahul migrants and the rest of the world until much later significant migrations, although it does seem naive to believe that both sets of peoples had absolutely no migratory interaction whatsoever.
Austronesians.
Throughout the Pacific island groups of Polynesia and Micronesia, New Zealand and the island groups of Melanesia, the northern coasts of New Guinea, maritime Southeast Asia, and even as far west as the Indian Ocean island of Madagascar, comparatively close to mainland Africa, all have speakers of a type of Austronesian language. This proves that Austronesian language speakers in general were expert seafarers. Exactly how and when these migrations happened has been a subject for debate, which creates a number of theories. The most widely accepted theory is the out of Taiwan theory. Experts in linguistics note that there are similarities between many of the languages within this vast area of the world's lands that make them distinct as a language group from all other language groups in the world, and that there are some fundamental words that likely originated from an ancient Taiwanese language. So there is a speculated Proto-Austronesian language being spoken on the island of Taiwan, and it is believed that it diversified and migrated from Taiwan around 3,500 years ago. Taiwan is just off the coast of mainland southeast China, and the societies of China were quite basic agricultural societies. The advancements of the Shang dynasty were developing a lot further north around the Yellow River, so this did not really affect Taiwan directly. So the cultures of Taiwan, who had likely migrated from the Chinese mainland sometime before this period in history, were able to evolve and develop in relative independence. There are archaeological similarities between the societies of Taiwan during this period and the societies of the islands of the Philippines, which is the first significant island group that sailors would encounter if sailing south from Taiwan. We can see a very similar pottery style from the period of around 4,000 years ago. So this strongly suggests a spreading of cultural knowledge from Taiwan to the Philippines, which would support a theory of linguistic migration between the two island groups. This is also supported by DNA studies which show similarities between the ancient tribes of the two island groups. So it is very difficult to argue with the fact that there is a definite ancient connection between the people of Taiwan and the people of the Philippines, and therefore we would have to conclude that these people had to have had a remarkable sailing skill. Some of the lands explored in this episode by Austronesian speakers will be exposed to human population for the first time. This is not the case with the Philippines. There were many tribes that had lived in the Philippines before the arrival of Austronesian speakers. One collection of tribes recognised are the Negritos, who were hunter-gatherers that may have populated the islands up to 50,000 years ago, although we cannot be completely clear about the ethnic history of the Philippines before the Austronesian expansion. It would not have been difficult to reach the islands of the Philippines during the last ice age due to their close proximity to the landmass of Sunda. Negrito tribes still live in the Philippines today, albeit in small numbers. In the north of the main island of the Philippines, Luzon, the Igorot people represent a collection of tribes which can be traced back to the earliest Austronesian-speaking settlers. The theory of the Austronesian expansion from Taiwan southwards has only really been hypothesised relatively recently, when the American linguist Robert Blust studied some of the particular common words of Austronesian languages, and during the 1980s concluded that the first Austronesian migration must have emanated from Taiwan. The concept of the Austronesian language group was recognised much earlier, however, during the late 19th to early 20th century by a Dutch East Indian linguist called Johan Hendrik Caspar Kern. But Kern suggested that the origin of this language group must have been mainland Southeast Asia. It does not appear that he considered Taiwan. Blust's out of Taiwan theory is still only a theory, but there does appear to be a lot of evidence that supports it. A continued southward expansion across the islands of the Philippines would have brought Austronesian speakers onto the Southeast Asian islands of Borneo and Sulawesi, and this is evident through archaeological study as well as linguistics and genetics. There still had to have been a good degree of seafaring skill to have made it onto all of these various islands almost 4,000 years ago. One technological innovation that is believed to have been something that Austronesian sailors created for their boats is called an outrigger. The outrigger is essentially a long stabilising device which is built onto the sides of boats to create a balancing influence on the water's surface parallel to the boat's main structure. It is thought that these outriggers enabled sailors to be able to traverse long distances across water with relative confidence. One theory regarding the evolution of outriggers is that the earliest rafts may have had two canoe-like structures built either side of the raft for rowers to propel the raft, which may have had other people or goods balanced on it. When sails were introduced to these rafts, it became very apparent that these canoe structures aided the buoyancy of the entire ship, and that even if the bulk of the ship was now built in the shape of a container as opposed to a raft, the canoe-shaped structures could still exist as stabilisers without the need for it to have rowers within or upon them. Therefore, they had become what we recognise today as outriggers. The evolution of the versatile crab claw sail, which could be used to sail both with and against the wind, gave the Austronesians a commanding edge in their sailing abilities that would not only enable them to travel long distances and populate otherwise unreachable areas of the planet, but also influence the abilities of those earliest eastern traders of the maritime Silk Road.
Lapita culture.
One of the biggest indicators of early Austronesian culture is pottery. A style of pottery was uncovered on the remote islands of New Caledonia, which are located around 750 miles east of the east coast of Australia. The site of the discovery is Lapita, and as such, this has provided a name for the associated culture who created such pottery. The Lapita culture were Austronesian language speakers, and clearly linked to our story of migration. So we should see how widespread the Lapita culture is, and how it is linked to the story of Austronesian expansion, and how Austronesians reached the remote islands of New Caledonia. A typical Lapita ceramic would have been made using the coiling technique, which involved using long cords of clay and building them up into the shape of a vase or a bowl that you may be intending to create. Angular pieces are often found among the circular pieces, and often we find that the clay was stamped with geometric patterns and anthropomorphic creatures, often typical of ancient animistic peoples. Animistic peoples could be found globally, although this does not mean that there is a direct relationship between them. Animistic peoples tended to believe that everything, whether living or inanimate, had a conscious spirit, and as such would create ritual practices which involved anthropomorphic creatures, that is, part human, part animal. These anthropomorphic creatures could be shamans that would act as an intermediary between the mortal world and the spirit world. We can see these anthropomorphic creatures celebrated in ancient art, such as Lapita pottery. Lapita pottery discoveries date from between 2,500 and 3,500 years ago, and can be found across a wide area of southwest Pacific islands and lands. The westernmost discovery of Lapita cultures can be found on the island of New Guinea, which is a large island to the east of the Indonesian island archipelago. If you recall, the original indigenous people of New Guinea were the Papuans, who were comparatively related to the Aboriginal Australians. Austronesians arrived in New Guinea at a similar point in history as the emergence of Lapita culture, when Papuans appeared to benefit from this new cultural exchange with their Austronesian immigrants. Historians do regard the Lapita culture as Austronesian in its identity rather than Papuan. It does appear that Papuans were producing pottery before the arrival of Austronesians, but that the emergence of Lapita culture pottery is after the arrival of Austronesians. The Austronesians that arrived in New Guinea brought pig farming with them as well, and, of course, their outrigger rafts, canoes and boats. Lapita pottery discoveries extend from New Guinea deep into the Pacific Ocean. This includes the island archipelagos of Papua New Guinea, such as the Bismarck Archipelago and the Northern Solomon Islands. It also includes the Santa Cruz Islands, the Vanuatu Archipelago, the islands of New Caledonia, the Fiji Archipelago, the Tonga Archipelago, and the Samoa Archipelago, among other islands. This is pretty much the entirety of the Oceanian sub-region called Melanesia, with Tonga and Samoa being considered just outside of Melanesia's eastern reaches in Polynesia. The lands and islands of Melanesia are dominated by Austronesian language speakers, so this is a very definite connection between the southward migration of Austronesians from Taiwan and then a subsequent eastern expansion into the Pacific Ocean, represented by the range of the Lapita cultures, who are believed to have spoken Austronesian languages. Of all the islands beyond New Guinea, which is where the Austronesian settlers encountered the indigenous Papuans, we believe that the peoples of the Lapita culture were the first humans to set foot on them.
Polynesia.
Tonga and Samoa are considered to be just beyond the eastern boundaries of what is classed as Melanesia. Fiji is really considered the limit of Melanesia, and when humans reached the islands of Fiji, Tonga and Samoa, the generations of humans born onto these islands really transitioned from Lapita culture that we have previously discussed to a much more Polynesian evolution. But what exactly do we mean by this? It is at this point that the islands of the Pacific Oceans beyond Tonga and Samoa become far more sparsely scattered and remote. Up to Tonga and Samoa, the journeys between island groups are relatively short, but the Polynesians who successfully navigated their way to the more remote islands of the Pacific Oceans were highly skilled seafarers. In the past, historians assumed that this was just a random expansion and that certain boats were being lucky enough to find islands from time to time. Although this is not completely untrue, it insinuates a lack of knowledge and ability that more recent historians do not accept. The outrigger canoes by this time were large and able to transport large groups of people and livestock over vast distances, and the navigators of these vessels were able to expertly use sails to travel in their chosen direction. They would observe many things in order to feel confident in their direction of travel. Studying the stars was something that seafarers in many areas of the world had and would come to use in order to plot their position. But the flight paths of birds would also give clues about the location of lands in the ocean. Some navigators would study the winds and the water currents in order to understand their position and their local environment. For those of us who are not expert seafarers, it is simple for us to assume that a load of people jumped in a boat and sailed until they bumped into an island. The reality is that the generations of people who lived on these islands were experts in their environments. They understood the nature of their environments, and they used their knowledge and experience of what they sensed in the world around them and beyond to make calculated decisions about where they sailed and how they sailed there. This is how they were able to discover remote islands in the vast Pacific Ocean. Dating the onward expansion is a little bit tricky. It does appear that there was a delay in the fluidity of the onward expansion that had previously been quite rapid. Archaeological evidence, which includes shards of lapita pottery, dates the first human presence on Tonga and Samoa back to 3 to 3,500 years ago. The next major island group that was populated after Tonga and Samoa may well have been the Marquesas Islands. There is very little to suggest that there was any human contact with the Marquesas Islands before 2,000 years ago. It is very important to state that we really don't know the exact timescales or points of contact during this period, but there does definitely appear to be a delay in the fluidity of expansion since the relatively rapid migration from Taiwan south and then east to Tonga and Samoa to the next major move eastwards. It is likely that the people who represented the conclusion of what is recognised as the Lapita culture may not have had the desire to cross the more open ocean landscape and chose to concentrate on developing the culture and trade links between the islands already inhabited that they knew that they could travel to with relative ease. It was during this time that the peoples of Melanesia further developed their knowledge and experience of their environment to become the seafaring experts that we have already described. These peoples are the descendants of the Lapita culture and developed the ability to travel vast distances across the waters looking for new opportunities. The earliest inhabitants of the Marquesas were able to develop and cultivate the natural resources of the islands as well as introduce their own domesticated crops and livestock, and then they would integrate the islands into the existing maritime trade network. The arrival of humans on Polynesian islands had a very quick impact on the existing ecosystems that existed there. We mentioned before that bird species would aid the navigation of sailors crossing the ocean, but bird species also suffered at the hands of Polynesian settlers, as we have evidence of indigenous bird species being driven to extinction by humans and their domestic animal companions and livestock. The arrival of humans in Polynesia had an irreversible effect on the fauna and flora of the islands, as we have seen throughout history in every part of the world. We even believe that uninvited guests on these boats, such as rats, would also have had a direct impact on the ecosystems. Interestingly, it did not take long for the subsequent generations of the Marquesas to forget their arrival on the island, and a creation myth would soon replace the story that archaeological evidence tells us. The people of the Marquesas believed that a god called Oetia created the islands one by one. This kind of creation myth is not just isolated to the Marquesas. We see it over and over again on other island groups. Samoans believed that a god called Tagaloa created the islands by throwing rocks into the sea, while the Fijians talk about their islands being created by a god called Ndenge. The formation of creation myths is a fundamental human instinct as demonstrated by their existence in all areas of the world, as it gives reason for existence and validity to the existence of a particular group of people. The validity cements identity, which binds people together and gives groups of peoples a shared culture designed to impress peoples outside of their own sphere. It is difficult to ascertain whether the islands of French Polynesia were settled before the Marquesas. It seems logical for the discovery of the islands, which are collectively called the Society Islands, the largest of which is Tahiti, to have been discovered by explorers before they reached the Marquesas. but if the settlement of the Society Islands occurred after the settlement of the Marquesas, then this may have represented a southwestern branch of expansion that would have actually ended up in the large island group of New Zealand. It seems incredible to think that the closely related countries of Australia and New Zealand should have such highly unrelated histories, but this references the distance between the two nations of around 2,000 kilometres, which makes New Zealand comparatively so much more remote from the rest of the world than Australia. Australia was first settled over 50,000 years ago, while New Zealand was first settled around just 700 years ago, making it the most recent major landmass in the world to be settled by humans. Those first inhabitants that reached New Zealand were indeed Austronesian speakers, and it is believed that they arrived on the islands no earlier than 1250, and we are able to use quite modern methods of dating such as radiocarbon dating to confirm this. European explorers discovered New Zealand during the 17th century and discovered that the original migrants had become around 100,000 people. To the Europeans, the New Zealanders called themselves the Maori to distinguish themselves. The Maori had been successful in New Zealand as demonstrated by their number. They had discovered a flightless bird called the moa that had previously been a successful species of the islands, but without a natural fear of humans were unable to prevent themselves being killed for meat, giving the first New Zealanders plenty to live on and driving the moa to extinction. The Maori then had to rely on hunter-gathering, agriculture and fishing to survive. Interestingly, their creation myth involved the arrival of boats to the islands, which may reflect their realisation of their human existence before their arrival, something often missing from other Pacific Island creation myths. Another boat arrival creation myth is that of the peoples of Easter Island. Easter Island is so far east that it is considerably closer to South America than it is to Australia. Our guess is that this island was first reached by humans during the 12th century. The peoples of the island referred to themselves and their island as the Rapa Nui, and soon started constructing large volcanic rock heads which could represent ancestor worship, although this is unclear. The construction of the heads required the use of timber to transport the rock and to stand the rock upright, and the Rapa Nui keenness to construct the heads led to the deforestation of the island, which proved to be disastrous for the population. Deforestation led to the disappearance of species and the ruination of the soil, leading to an agricultural crisis and an inability to build canoes and tools essential for obtaining and preparing food, and even leaving the island altogether. By the time Europeans discovered the island in 1722, the population, once many thousands, was almost down to its last 100 inhabitants, who in some cases had resorted to cannibalism to survive.
Other lands.
Austronesian expansion has been proved linguistically to not be restricted to Melanesia and Polynesia. To the north of Melanesia and east of the Philippines in the western Pacific are some much smaller island groups which are geographically and culturally linked together as Micronesia. Being much closer to Asia, the islands of Micronesia were first inhabited much earlier than those of Polynesia. For example, the islands of Palau were definitely inhabited before the expansion hesitation at Tonga and Samoa, so Micronesia can be considered as being accessed during the initial migration wave. Micronesia is to the north of the eastward Pacific migration described in the podcast episode, and these islands became vital in the Pacific theatre of the Second World War between Japan and the United States and their allies. Another important island archipelago in this conflict during the 1940s was the Hawaiian archipelago, which is now itself a state within the United States. Unlike Micronesia, Hawaii is deep into the Pacific Ocean, so it is considered to be Polynesian, and as such it was first populated by Austronesian language speakers much more recently, probably only within the most recent 1,000 years. Reaching Hawaii, as with reaching Easter Island, required incredible seafaring abilities beyond anything that humankind had achieved in history. European explorers were centuries behind these capabilities, as Austronesians were apparently able to travel thousands of miles across the ocean waters. Recent studies of the genetic mixture of populations of Easter Island strongly suggest that there is a presence of South American DNA that could very well date back to before Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas. Although this wouldn't predate the Viking arrival in the Americas of around 1000 CE, it is still a significant and logical possibility that if humans had the ability to sail to Easter Island, then they would have certainly been able to cover the remaining 2,000 miles to South America. There is still much to discover about this. Finally, it is very important to note that we concentrated our entire episode on the eastward expansion into the Pacific based on archaeology, culture and linguistics demonstrating a migration connection between the lands and islands. Off the eastern coast of Africa, across the Indian Ocean from Southeast Asia, lies the large island of Madagascar. It is not surprising to discover that Bantu language speakers from continental Africa reached this island before the arrival of European explorers. But it may be surprising to learn that continental Africans were not the first to arrive in Madagascar. The most recent studies point towards an initial settlement dating back to the middle of the first millennium, and it was also part of the Austronesian expansion. When Europeans first discovered Madagascar, they would discover a unique Malagasy culture, speakers of an Austronesian language and demonstrating a hybrid of Austronesian and Bantu culture. There really were very little other permanent cultural expansions since the Neolithic Revolution that compare in nature to the Austronesian expansion. Certainly, European explorers have left an indelible mark on the entire world and rapidly took control of the American continent, but the ancient seafaring abilities of the Austronesians and their legacy really are quite unique.
Choice Hotels get you more of what you value. Comfort Inn, it's calling your name. Save on the stay. Oh, and free waffles are yours to claim. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Thank you ever so much for listening to this week's episode of the History of the World podcast on the Austronesian expansion. What a fascinating subject, and probably one we don't talk about enough. Now, if you enjoy the podcast and you would like to support the podcast, then please visit our website, click on the Patreon link and sign up to make a monthly contribution. When you do, you will become a lifelong member of the History of the World podcast Illuminati, and you'll qualify for gifts and rewards. And next month I'll be addressing another wave of those gifts and rewards. So you might find that one's on its way to you and will arrive before Christmas. Now, this week we welcome to the History of the World podcast Illuminati Rudy Reyes and James Connors II. So I'd like to really sincerely thank you for your pledges of support for the podcast. It really does make a difference. Now, if you'd like to get in touch with the podcast, I love it when you do. Drop me a line at the History of the World podcast at mail.com. I'll say that once again, History of the World podcast at mail.com. It's by far the most efficient way to reach me, I promise you. And you can also follow the podcast on social media at Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Tumblr, Threads, and Mastodon. And if you can't get enough of the podcast, look out for our special debrief episodes, where I'll be talking some more about the episode that you just listened to and a few extra bits and pieces from the world of the History of the World podcast.
Listener messages and reviews.
It was so important for me to make that point because I do struggle to catch up with all of my messages on all of the various different platforms that the History of the World podcast is on. And, if you have emailed in or you've messaged in, well, if you've emailed in, I would have certainly read it and replied to it because I'm always on top of the emails. However, if I'm honest, the other forms of media are not something I'm very sharp with. And I understand a lot of you may have tried to contact me through Facebook and Instagram. I'm just not very good at keeping on top of those platforms, and I apologise for that. I have a busy life, and it really is a lot for me to have to deal with, and I apologise for that. However, I did go into the Meta Business Suite this week, and I dug out a message from a J. Trevor Chapman who's put, "Hi Chris, I'm a fan of your podcast. Have been listening for a couple of years now. I'm wondering if you offer advertising on your podcast. If so, do you have a page with details?" Yes, I do offer advertising. As you know, we run adverts on the podcast. It also helps hugely to keep this podcast a free production. So don't diss the ads, they're there to help us all. But yes, I can offer private advertisements. Of course, just contact me directly. Ram Kumar B has written in on Instagram and has put, "Hello Chris, thanks a lot for this brilliant podcast. I'm still just 5 episodes into this, and it's mind-blowing how beautiful, concise the information is disseminated to the audience. Thanks a ton." Well, that's a very kind message, Ram. Thank you so much. Mike Reed has written in from Facebook and has put, "I'm studying to begin teaching history in middle school USA, and I was looking for a podcast talking about Akkadian Sumerian history on Spotify." Well, that was some time ago. What a fascinating subject that was. When I saw that Akkadian history was the 2nd episode of Volume 2, I had to check it out from the beginning. Started 3 days ago at the time of writing this, and I absolutely love how delightfully British the narrator is. It's almost like an affliction, isn't it? Yes, delightfully British. That's me. Well articulated and easy to listen to and very informative. Love it. Keep it up. Just finished Volume 1. You did Volume 1 in 3 days. My goodness me. That is some listening. I can't bear to listen to my voice for more than 5 minutes. So I just can't imagine what that's like. Anyway, thank you so much for the message, Mike. It's very kind of you. I think that's it for this week. I don't have any other reviews or messages to read out. So once again, I'd like to thank you so much for listening. And this was a wonderful episode. I really enjoyed writing it, and of course, after we spent so much time discussing East Asian history, it was nice just to move over the waters and move into another area. Now, coming up in our next episodes, we're going to be exploring a little bit more about a couple of the places we landed at during this Austronesian expansion story. We're going to be exploring the story of the New Zealand Maori, and we'll also, after that, episode 84 will be about the Rapa Nui of Easter Island. So if you enjoy your cultural stories, you'll really enjoy both of those episodes. So looking forward to that. As for this week, that's all. Look out for the Illuminati debrief episode in the next day or two. And until we meet again, thanks for listening. And of course, be good.
The History of the World podcast, written and presented by Chris Hasler. Please consider making a financial contribution by going to the historyoftheworldpodcast.com website and clicking on the Patreon link. Email the show at historyoftheworldpodcast@mail.com. And don't forget to join our social media at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Tumblr. See you next time.